So there are 5 what I just called principal mindsets that I wanted to share real quick. The first is a mindset of love. And I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 13, and I think everyone is familiar with this, probably because it's read at every wedding. But interestingly enough, it actually isn't in the context of marriage, although I'm not saying it couldn't be applied to that, but it's in the context of gifts. Gifts of prophecy, gifts of teaching, of ministry. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. But whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Where there is knowledge, it will vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face, and now I know in part, but then I shall know, just as I also am known. And now abide faith, hope, love, these 3, but the greatest of these is love. And this mindset, I mentioned, is in the context of gifts, and it's been my experience, a struggle of my own, and what I've seen both in organizations and with individual relationships, that this principle of love is forgotten. And you might have the greatest talents imaginable. You might be a great leader. You've got great ideas. But it's worthless if you have not love. And I couldn't help but to think when Toby mentioned earlier about sending out Satan to fight Satan, how if we're going out in doing this work without love, without the love that's defined here, clearly described, then that's clearly wrong. There is a parallel with this passage in my mind as I look at it with the fruit of the Spirit. You know, that if we're walking in the Spirit, these things come out. Love, joy, peace, patience, and kindness, and goodness, and faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These are all embedded in this passage in 1 Corinthians 13 as well. And as I see us go out and do this work, and many who neglect this, I can't help but to be reminded of Jesus' teachings about, of Jesus' words of saying, there'll be many who will say, Lord, Lord, didn't we do this in your name? Didn't we do all these great things in your name? And Jesus is going to say, I never knew you. I never knew you. That's sobering and frightening to me. And I think that the temptation can come from many angles to neglect this principle. I know it does for me, but when we're harsh, impatient, cruel, it's not justified by our talents or our knowledge or some great idea or motive we have. And I've seen times when there is a complete disregard for love because it is too time-consuming and inconvenient to be polite instead of rude. So, the mindset of love. The second, a mindset of humility. And humility, the opposite of pride, it's a principle we see throughout Scripture. Again, another basic bread and butter thing. When we are, with humility, I think of being teachable, that when we're not teachable, when we're not open to correction, when we don't, our bias should be that we're quick to respond to the possibility that we're wrong. If someone has been loving enough and bold enough to approach us on that, we need to be open to that. And there is factors that play in this, of course, but the opposite of humility being pride. That pride's going to play into this. Pride is a sin that we have to watch out for. And I think there's also a human desire or reaction, instinct to deny things that, to have denial when we're approached about something we might be doing wrong. Referencing back to the submarine days again, they teach a submariner to always obey his instrumentation. Your instrumentation's telling you you have flooding in the engine room and a steam line rupture. You take immediate action for that, and you believe what you see there. Don't try and explain it away that there's something wrong with your instrumentation, or perhaps there's some other indicators that are going to say something different. You take immediate action and you correct it, because you'll be dead if you don't. But they drill this in you because there is this human response to deny things that you think are terribly wrong. And again, that could be coming about just from pride itself, or it's just this denial that things are really bad. I think this is revealed in the church. Church's response, this is part of the problem we deal with, that over the years I've met with pastors or just individual lay people who will say, well, this abortion isn't a problem at my church. Abortion isn't, we have a good church, Bible-believing, God-fearing people. This isn't something we need to worry about. When all evidence, of course, is pointing to something else, when we know that the statistics tell us, that common sense tells us that it is a problem. So be teachable, be open to correction, be quick to say, I could be wrong, and open to that, and be reminded of the humility that Christ had, in that he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. And going back to this 1 Corinthians passage in the preceding chapter, I mentioned there was the discussion of giftings, and how there's honor and dishonor, and what I think the giftings that we might elevate are actually the ones that will receive less honor, and the giftings that we might think as lowly here are actually receiving the highest honor. So again, humility in all that we do. The third one, a mindset of complete trust in God. Complete trust in God. A lack of this has led to pragmatism. That is, pragmatic ideas that doubt God, that assume God is not real, that he's not there. It has led to compromise. A lack of trust in God would lead to compromise, and I'm sure that compromise is good in some cases, but not when it comes to obedience to God. And that means supporting candidates that authorize the murdering of babies, of some babies, is wrong. And when we jump on board with this idea of pragmatically or incrementally removing an evil, and what we're agreeing to do is to do some evil to try and bring about good, or do a lesser evil to bring about good, this is problematic in that it's stemming from a lack of trust in God in who He is and what He's capable of doing. Now with this, there's also a complete trust in God is also going to bring to us a mindset of this idea of providence and all the things that come our way. Like, what happens when things go wrong? What is our reaction? Do we have a complete trust in God or not? And we can allow secondary circumstances to alter what we're doing, to doubt God, and ultimately sin. And I wanted to read a quick quote here from Hannah Whitall Smith's Christian classic, The Christian Secret to a Happy Life. And again, the context here is about trust in God in the midst of circumstances that you think are, that don't meet your expectations. It create trials. She's telling a story of a lesson she learned. She says, I learned this lesson practically and experimentally long years before I knew the scriptural truth concerning it. I was attending a prayer meeting held for the promotion of scriptural holiness when a strange lady rose to speak, and I looked at her, wondering who she could be, little thinking she was to bring a message to my soul which would teach me such a grand lesson. She said she had great difficulty in living the life of faith on account of the second causes that seemed to her to control nearly everything that concerned her. Her perplexity became so great, there at last she began to ask God to teach her the truth about it, whether He really was in everything or not. After praying this for a few days, she had what she described as a vision. She thought she was in a perfectly dark place and that there advanced towards her from a distance a body of light which gradually surrounded and enveloped her and everything around her. As it approached, a voice seemed to say, "This is the presence of God. This is the presence of God." While surrounded with this presence, all the great and awful things in life seemed to pass before her. Fighting armies, wicked men, raging beasts, storms and pestilences, sin and suffering of every kind. She shrank back at first in terror, but soon she saw the presence of God so surrounded and enveloped each one of these that not a lion could reach out its paw, nor a bullet fly through the air, except as His presence moved out of the way to permit it. And she saw that there be ever so thin a sheet, as it were, of this glorious presence between herself and the most terrible violence, not a hair of her head could be ruffled, nor anything touch her, unless the presence divided to let the evil through. Then all the small and annoying things of life passed before her, and equally she saw that these all were so enveloped in the presence of God that not a cross look, not a harsh word, nor petty trial of any kind could reach her unless His presence moved out of the way to let them through. Now, what do I mean by all this? Or what's the point I'm trying to get to here? Is that this mindset of a complete and utter trust in God, maybe I should even put that first, is easy to violate. And I implore us to consider that in all the little things and even the big things, and knowing that God is in control of all these things. And I've seen people lash out at one another when things don't go right. I've seen people panic and say, "Oh, this is horrible, this is it." And yeah, I mean, we can learn from our lessons. We pick up wisdom and maybe do's and don'ts of how we carry out the work, and maybe that wasn't such a good idea and we'll do it differently. But as we are faithful to God, as we trust Him, as we obey Him, when things go awry. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So we have a mindset of love, a mindset of humility, a mindset of a complete trust in God, a mindset, and fourth, a mindset of patience or long-suffering. This one connected very much to the one of just trust, but embracing suffering, embracing the fight instead of fretting and complaining. God causes all things to work together for good. We know this. James 1:2-4, to count it all joy when we fall into various trials. Knowing that the testing of our faith produces patience. And let patience have that perfect work, that we may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. In Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that we're to consider it blessed when we're persecuted for righteousness' sake and persecuted for His name's sake. Consider it a blessing when we have trials. That's the mindset of patience. The King James Version uses the word long-suffering, which I think is a great word for that, because that's the way we feel many times in that. Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place, she says, no pit is so deep that God's love is not deeper yet. So you are in a fight. The walk of the following Christ is a fight. It's warfare. Keep your chin down, keep your jab going, and get in the fight. Stay in the fight. Even when you get smashed, get back up. So God is seeking to do things in us that can only be done in the fight. Suffering is repeated throughout the Scripture, and there are things that God does through that we don't understand. And we need to embrace it. We need to encourage one another, remind one another of this mindset of patience and staying in the fight. And last, a mindset, I call this a mindset of a true champion, or a godly champion. And this one I think distinguishes the abolitionist movement from the average sort of pro-life mindset. I want to read from 1 Samuel now. 1 Samuel 17. Story we all know, but is extremely applicable today, in my opinion. Now, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze armor on his legs, and bronze javelin between his shoulders. And now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spear head weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Then Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. And now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons, and the man was old and advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of these 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. The Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son, David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight, and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, by name, coming up from the armies of Philistine, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father house exemption from taxes in Israel. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done to him by the man who kills him. And now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Skip ahead, verse 39. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his God. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of the host, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran, stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. That's the mindset of a champion, a true champion. They said Goliath, it said, the scriptures say Goliath was a champion, but a champion of fighting, a champion of flesh fighting. David was a true champion in that he had this complete and utter trust in God, knowing full well what he was going into, but knowing full well that God was at his side. And his motivation was to glorify God. His motivation was, as he said, that all of the world would see that the God of Israel is alive and well. And you can imagine God looking down on this as for 40 days Saul's army stood there afraid. And you can imagine God thinking, really? There's not one of you? There's not one of you who knows who I am? There's not one of you who's willing to even die out there? I've commanded you to go fight this, to go take this land, and not one of you. And it takes a young boy who just has an utter trust in God and has a mindset that I'm going to reject mediocrity, I'm going to reject compromise. You don't see David trying to work out some kind of compromise with the Philistines or with this giant. Well, maybe we can divide the land up a little way and then later on we'll take more of it. He says, no, God has commanded us to go take this land. This man is defying God. I'm going to go shut him down. That's the mindset of a champion. A true champion seeking to glorify God, not with a mindset of compromise and what I would ultimately say is a mindset of a loser. I'm going to wrap this up, but this might sound, all of what I said is really basic, and I sometimes have talked to friends who maybe they don't like listening to certain teachers or Bible teachers or whatever, because they already know what they're saying. But in life, and I think it applies in our spiritual life, that these fundamentals and basics are so easily forgotten, become so problematic, and we tend to overcomplicate things because we're forgetting the basics. I'm just going to illustrate this a little bit further. A couple of years ago, University of Oregon, which I'm not a fan of, I'm an Oregon State Beaver, by the way, but the University of Oregon was in the national championship game against Auburn. Maybe some of you remember this. And close game. Down towards the end, there was a play that just stunned me. The Auburn running back takes a handoff, runs a few yards, he gets tackled. But there's no whistle. And everybody stops playing. The running back stands up, and people are looking around, and suddenly he just takes off running again, and he goes about 40 yards more, puts them in field goal range that they would ultimately, Auburn would win the game. What had happened was when he was tackled, his knees actually didn't touch the ground. He landed on top of another player. But it looked like he was tackled. He was down. the sideline, the guys in the sideline were screaming at the running back because they kind of noticed there was no whistle, but most people didn't notice. And I just thought, that is so ironic and amazing, but just the truth. The most fundamental thing, if anyone's played football, that you are pounded into you when you start as a peewee, you don't stop until you hear the whistle. I mean, that's as basic as it gets. Until you hear the official's whistle, don't stop. And yet, at the highest level of college football, in the most important game, the best players in the nation, they violated this, and it cost them the game. You see this in all kinds of things. I was talking to Gabby Smedra earlier about health and how oftentimes our health is just the simple things that can influence that, our physical bodies. And anyway, we could go on and on, but I just wanted to pound that home that we don't forget these principles. So when we forget them, I wanted to just illustrate something that, to close here, related to the church project, and I think is what comes out, and when these principles are violated, when we neglect love, when we neglect the humility, and when we lack trust, when we don't embrace the suffering, and we don't go about our work for God as a true champion, red hot, rejecting lukewarmness, there's fruit that comes about from that. So I'm going to run a video, and you're going to think this is crazy when you see this, but watch closely.
A chance. The hunt is on. The wolf panics the herd, and the weak and young are singled out. The calf is separated from its mother.
Next. So the wolf panics the herd, and the weak and the young are singled out. Now, when I first saw this video, it was years ago, and that just struck me of what a picture of fear and panic, what that looks like, of self-centeredness, of self-absorption. Because I looked at it, I thought, why doesn't that herd just turn around and smash that wolf? I mean, it looks ridiculous. You got this little wolf and this entire herd of these caribou, but the big ones, they're not too worried. They're not at risk. And a bunch of the others just follow along. Well, we better run too. And then the weak and the young get singled out, and they sacrifice a calf. Next picture. There's another view of it. Wolf, calf. Now, next. Okay, so this might be a little hard to see from the back there, but what you're looking at are, all the red dots are churches. This is from just, you could pick any city in America and you're going to get the same image. A zillion churches. And you know what's right here? An abortion clinic. Can you go back one again? And they go forward. The only difference I see in the pictures is that there's a lot more churches than Caribou. So we're not going to do that as abolitionists. We're going to point this out. We're going to expose this as the greater evil, if I can say that. This is the greater evil than abortion itself. That people who claim the name of Christ would allow this to happen and act like a bunch of caribou. No, instead we're going to do our best to call for proper action. And I'll end with this slide that is actually a picture of a poster I have on my wall. And I have this poster in part because I think it's a cool picture. But guy's got an abolitionist beard.
Is that Johnny Hendricks?
It looks like Johnny Hendricks. It's not. It's Brett Cooper, who's another professional fighter. It's got an AHA symbol in the ring there. But no, this is a poster I put on my wall as a reminder to myself when I come in to work to not be apathetic, to not be lazy, to use my time well, to love the Lord with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength in the work that I'm doing. And these passages that we live by, and I just say attack, 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 but you can't see it probably from there because they're small, but these passages are, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Look to the Lord in His strength, seek His face always. Though He slay me, yet I will hope in Him. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. All men will hate you because of me, but he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And then I just end by referring back to the story of David and Jonathan, his friend, who said, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised, and it may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few."